I'm Megan Voorhees. I'm director of ACARA, which is one of the programs in the leadership and education portfolio at the Institute of the Environment. I'm also the lead on the Ecolab Experiential Education Scholarships, where we give out $60,000 a year to Twin Cities-based undergraduate students who don't have the funds to participate in sustainability internships, learning abroad courses focused on sustainability, or to propose their own leadership projects around sustainability. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, please find me, and we also have information at the front desk. I'm excited about our focus this morning on community engaged scholarship as a form of scholarship that cuts across teaching, research, and service. Before I introduce our great panel, I do want to note that if you want to learn more about this form of engaged scholarship, or you're already doing the work and want to connect more with other colleagues, you should be sure to check out the resources available from the university's Office of Public Engagement. And also the Resilient Communities Project, which is housed here in this building, is offering a great workshop series. Looks really interesting, specifically on this topic this fall. And I'll have flyers about the workshops in the atrium after this session. So now I'm pleased to introduce our panel. Our first person is Dr. Cathy Jordan. She's our new Associate Director of Leadership and Education at the Institute of the Environment and Professor of Pediatrics in the Medical School. She's also an Institute of the Environment Fellow. She co-led a 10-year-long community-based participatory research initiative on childhood lead poisoning. She teaches about CBPR and partnership development and conducts professional development for faculty and promotion and tenure committee members about recognizing and rewarding quality community-engaged scholarship in promotion and tenure. That's what Cathy said. I think I'm going to add, I used to be the director of the Public Service Center at UC Berkeley for many years, and I always used Cathy's work, so she's really shaped the field nationally, not just here on this campus. Dr. Crystal Ng, are you here? Oh, good. I'm feeling better. You guys could come on down. Is an assistant professor of hydrogeology in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. Trained as a hydraulic computer modeler, her experience with engaged scholarship began just 2 years ago through her research on wild rice. Wild rice has long been and continues to be of deep cultural importance to many Native people in the Great Lakes region, and she has found that understanding how to protect and preserve it requires a close collaboration with tribal partners. Thank you for your work. Dr. Nick Phelps is a researcher in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department and the director of the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. In both roles, Nick has worked to engage community stakeholders at local to federal levels on topics related to the health and sustainability of Minnesota's lakes. Thanks for being here. Virajita Singh is Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota, where she brings her expertise in design thinking, public interest design, and partnership studies to catalyze and support equity and diversity work of colleges and other academic units across the university. Trained as an architect, Virajita is also Senior Research Fellow and faculty in the College of Design, where she leads the Design for Community Resilience program she founded at the Center for Sustainable Building Research, working with rural and urban communities to meet their needs using regenerative design. Her current academic work is focused on exploring the applied intersections of cultural transformation theory, partnership models, and design thinking as a strategy, particularly as it applies to higher education context, and on applying participatory design to Back to the Indigenous Futures, a Grand Challenges research project working with her interdisciplinary university colleagues in collaboration with Dakota and Micronesian community members in western Minnesota. There will be time for questions if folks want to ask where she sleeps, when she sleeps, how she does that. That might be okay. The panel today will be moderated by Carissa Slotterback, Associate Dean and Associate Dean here at the Humphrey School, and Associate Professor in Urban and Regional Planning. She's also an Institute on the Environment Fellow. Her research is focused on public engagement and decision-making in environmental and land use planning. She has led a number of initiatives focused on interdisciplinary and engaged research and education, including co-founding and directing the Resilient Communities Project and serving as Director of Research Engagement in the Office of the Vice President for Research, where she created and implemented multiple initiatives to advance collaborative research within the university and with external partners. With that, let's welcome our panel to the stage.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan, for kicking this off, and thanks, Jessica, for a great welcome today. As Associate Dean at the Humphrey School, I just want to share a welcome to the Humphrey. we're really glad that you're here. IonE is a tremendous partner for the Humphrey School, for our faculty, for our students, for our alums, as we connect with work related to the environment. So we've really, really valued the collaborations that we've had with IonE over the years, and happy to have you all here. So I am super fortunate to be able to moderate this panel with folks who are true leaders at the University of Minnesota and in our broader community around community engagement. I'm not going to say much to kick this off because I think they have so many interesting things to share, and I want to be able to have time for questions from you as well about this really, really important topic. So I'm just going to dive in and ask each of the panelists to share just a little bit about the work that they do. How does community engaged scholarship fit into their work? Maybe just share a couple of minutes, each of you. And I'm going to mix it up by starting with Crystal at the end.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So I'm part of an interdisciplinary team. Actually, I'm glad to see a couple people here from our team. And we are examining the ecology and the policy and human dimension sides of wild rice, all under the understanding of its very deep cultural importance to Native people throughout the region. And a really, really core part of that project is to really prioritize tribal concerns and perspectives on wild rice. And this is really essential because on this topic of wild rice, there really is a fraught history. So just thinking about how Jessica opened today, there is that entire long history of colonialization. And more recently, there's also been a lot of tension between tribes and university researchers, including from University of Minnesota on wild rice. And so as part of our project, it's been really important to try to change that and have a different model of what research can look like around wild rice, and one in which it's built on a very close collaboration with tribal partners, because it's really only through that way that we can prioritize their concerns. And what we're finding is that this is able to do things like really ensure that we have a positive impact and be able to help with important issues such as indigenous resource sovereignty, and at the same time also really further our understanding and really broaden our, our Western science perspective on how the ecosystem works with the types of perspectives that our tribal partners can bring to us.
Great, thank you. Virajita.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll focus on two aspects of my work. I think in the introduction, the Design for Community Resilience program was mentioned, and it's housed within the Center for Sustainable Building Research, which is in the College of Design, affiliated with the School of Architecture. And the work there is really about engaging the power of design and design thinking in understanding the needs of communities and meeting them where they're at, and using design in service of actually creating the future with them. And the process involves often engaging with one community at a time over a period. Often it's aligned with the semester so that we can have graduate students participate in it. And many times the support for all of this work comes across from different sources. The Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships is a beloved partner on this work from a funding perspective, as well as in leading the work, as well as Cura, that has been very instrumental in funding the students' work on it. But essentially, even though these projects are short and short in time frame, our goal is to kind of build trust with the community and get to a place where we're designing and co-designing together and addressing sustainability and regenerative design from a social perspective, from an environmental perspective, and also from an economic perspective. I think the power of design to do this work is sort of where the core of this is, because design is about thinking forward. We have a lot of things that need to be addressed in terms of problem solving. There's also historic inequities, but we're trying to create a future that the communities can or the communities aspire to using design processes. I also wanted to mention that related to my teaching as well, that the focus on real-world problem solving is really critical. It has been historically true in design schools where we've used fictitious problems on fictitious sites. I think there are too many problems in the world that are real and available to us, and so that's sort of at the crux of my work as well. And finally, I mentioned the Grand Challenges project was mentioned, and so that's a whole new body of work in terms of focusing in an interdisciplinary way through the university context, the capacities we have here, which are tremendous, to partner with indigenous communities to achieve, again, a new future.
Thank you. Great. All right, Nick.
Good morning, everybody. To give you a little context of where I'm coming from, I'm a native Minnesotan, and I work on fish, the health of fish populations, aquaculture, and aquatic invasive species. And I thought I knew what Minnesota needed as it related to those issues. And I thought for sure I'd have a receptive audience here in the state as I started my research program. But it was a pretty humbling experience as I started writing grants and publishing papers that early work didn't have a lot of real-world value, that what I thought was important might not really be what people needed. So I took a hard look at what I was doing, especially as it related to engaging community members, and I use that term broadly, all sorts of different stakeholders, from local groups to federal agencies and everybody in between. And I figured out, or I've tried to figure out a way to kind of blend this together, especially on the development of the research questions. I take very little credit for the ideas, the projects that I'm working on. I go to stakeholder groups, to the Lake Association or the DNR or the legislature, and ask them what problems they have. What knowledge gaps do you need filled? What can researchers do to help? And that really starts the ball rolling. I do that, it's informal hallway conversations, and it's also formal research assessments that can make that happen. Then we use those questions, we come back to campus, and we assemble teams of some of you in this room to help work on them. And then we integrate those partners who had those questions in the research. So they're, if not a formal collaborator in the project, advisory members to keep us focused on what they really need. And then as that project comes to fruition, communicating it back out to those people. And broadly, I spend as much time talking with end users, like the management agencies, as I do talking to lake associations and testifying at the Capitol. It's important that that information gets out and that they understand how it was developed. This has resulted in much more actionable science that's being used by people, but it's also increased the trust in the work that's being done. It's been interesting to see the evolution of a project. If they have a stake in developing the question, they understand where it came from, they understand how it was done, and then when it comes time to use or implement, it makes much more sense to them. And that's been productive for me as a researcher, and hopefully been helpful for the community groups we work with.
Great, thank you. Cathy.
Good morning, everyone. As Megan mentioned, my background is in community-based participatory research. Back when I first came to the University of Minnesota in the early 90s as a pediatric neuropsychology postdoctoral fellow, I got brought into what turned out to be a 10-year-long, really deep and genuine trust-building, power-sharing CBPR partnership with residents of the Phelps neighborhood in South Minneapolis, 5 departments of the university, numerous nonprofit organizations, Valspar Paint Company, Representative Karen Clark's office, Honeywell Foundation, and others. And I certainly came into that having zero experience or preparation for that kind of deep community engagement. And so it was a steep learning curve for me, but one that absolutely transformed my career. And I became fascinated by not just what we were learning about childhood lead poisoning, in terms of preventing it and understanding the developmental impacts of it. I also became really fascinated by that process of participatory research and sort of working side by side in this power sharing, participatory, reciprocal sort of way with members of the community, residents, nonprofit organizations, corporations, foundations, et cetera, and elected officials. And that transformed my career. And I moved from being a community engaged scholar to a scholar of engagement. So I began to study and write about and talk about and teach about participatory approaches, and I began doing faculty development work here on our campus and at numerous other campuses on how faculty can present their best case for promotion and tenure as community engaged scholars, which basically means helping them figure out how to pull the scholarship out of that community engaged work. And I also began working with P&T committees and administrators on how to create institutional change and how to recognize and reward community engaged scholarship in the P&T process.
Great, thank you. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about as I reflect on my own work and think about the kind of trajectory for community engaged scholarship and just community engagement more broadly is often we have a motivation to have community engagement related to a project or research that we're doing or to understand a problem. And I've been thinking a lot about what if the goal leading into any of those decisions about doing community engagement was a goal of building a long-term relationship? How would that change the way that we design a participatory process? How would that change the way we think about who is involved, the ways that we interact with people, the responsibilities that we have for ongoing engagement? So I think that leads me to a question that I want the panelists to think about is really, what are one or two key components of sustained and truly collaborative university community partnerships or community engagement? And anybody want to start?
I'll start.
Thanks.
Can I do 6 instead of 2?
6 really short ones. Yeah.
The reason I say that is because through my co-teaching with my community partner, Susan Gust, we developed something that we call the 6 tenets of CBPR, which really is my response to this question. So we talk about some really foundational concepts of shared power, mutual trust, mutual respect, mutual benefit, shared power, and reflection as a sort of reflective practice. Reflection is incredibly important. And those are 6 tenets that we, in hindsight, developed after that 10-year-long CBPR partnership, but one that we use as sort of the foundation for our teaching about how to do partnered work and collaborative work, participatory work well.
Great, thank you. Nick?
It's hard to follow that.
She took
What she
all
said
of it.
sounds great. Yeah, my most overused phrase, I think, is finding the win-win. Shared goals going into it, I think, are really important. If you're not both getting something out of it, you as the researcher and them as the community members, it probably isn't going to last very long, not even through a project or some follow-up work. So setting up expectations and agreeing upon that has been something I've tried to focus on.
Great. So I think one of the key things is sort of authenticity and authentic relationship building. Transparency as we start to work with the communities is critical. And I've heard this phrase, and I'm sorry I can't attribute it, but sort of moving at the speed of trust. You know, we can only move so fast. And given the structures that we are kind of, navigating with university timelines and budgets and so on, we have very little time. So I think that trust building is really critical. The advantage that we have in our work is that the community is aspiring to something. You know, it's usually about perhaps a building, perhaps a downtown, perhaps a landscape that they're trying to develop for their future, for their community. And that, so it's a goal that's shared by most of the community, and it's something that we can all focus on. So it's then easier to become partners towards achieving that goal. So I think that's also another aspect of it, that if you can find something that's outside that you can all work on together, it just becomes easier. One more thing I'll add is that I'm just reflecting on related to the question, to the fact that In 2017, we did some work with Thief River Falls about envisioning their downtown and the development that we did there. And it involved engaging many partners, the city and the community and organizations like big business like DigiKey and others. And 2 years later, we were invited back this year to work on their old auditorium building, which is a 1933 WPA project that has really a strong significance for the community, but they're trying to envision what it might be. And to me, just that invitation back seemed to suggest that we've built that relationship and they want us back. And it's a delicate process sometimes because we're, as the university, we're in between many of these partners and many of these interests, not all on the same page. And so we have to navigate that carefully, but if you come back to that authentic, transparent relationship, we can actually build many relationships through that process that then are almost, they're long-lasting. Thanks.
Crystal.
I want to say I actually appreciated that most of you actually in your opening kind of explained a little bit of the personal history, and I think I gave that to my introduction, that I'm actually very new to this. I hope questions later on, any of you who are trying to figure out how to actually do a transition from kind of just standard unengaged research into engaged research. I have very new personal experience with that. So actually this question of how do you have those sustained partnerships is something that I've got to say I'm actively trying to figure out right now. And it's actually really good to hear your insights about it. I will say that it's a critical piece, and I think it's one that we're not used to because, as you said, Carissa, I think we're usually thinking about finite projects, 2 to 3 year funded projects. And one thing I've definitely learned in our project is that that's not going to cut it. It's I think, Virajita, what you were saying, authenticity and trust are absolutely critical, and I hope that in our project we are building a sustained and lasting partnership, and I know that it's been those two core pieces that I think are beginning it, and I think it's it's really the hook that's going to make sure that we sustain it. And in terms of how to establish that, just a lot of just honesty and time, face-to-face time. I'll say one of our partners, our Treble partners, I remember early on, he looked at me and he said, I've got radar for who's actually sincere and authentic. And he kind of looked at me and he's like, you're getting through my radar so far. And I think I've gotten a little bit farther because we keep seeing each other, and we now know about each other's families and about each other's lives, and I think that's going to be a piece of it. And I mean, I actually am glad to be hearing experiences of those of you who actually have seen sort of a trajectory of sustained partnerships.
Thank you for that. Moving on and kind of building on what we've been talking about, this kind of research and this kind of engagement is exceptionally important. I would argue it's really an essential obligation for all of us who are faculty or staff or students at a public research university, especially a land-grant institution. It's a really central obligation that we have to our society, to Minnesota. And it can also be really, really challenging to be able to do this work. And I think what I'd love to hear from the panelists is maybe a couple of challenges that you faced in doing this work, and they could be challenges within the university or outside, and then maybe some tips or practices that you've used to overcome any of those challenges. Anybody want to start?
Sure, I can go. I don't.
Thanks.
I have, for better or worse, plenty of challenges with this too. It's not super easy making that shift and putting yourself out there and sort of relying a project on external people. There's a lot of trust that goes both directions, and that has been not always there, and it's been a challenge. And some of what was already said on building those relationships is what we've tried to do to get around some of those issues. It's also one of the challenges relying on external groups or community members to help inform a research program. There's some vulnerability there for me as a researcher to go out and say, tell me what I should do, what I should know. It's also a bit vulnerable for them. They need to say, here's what we don't know. Here's a legislature saying, here are the questions we have. We don't have all the answers. Help me figure it out. And if you don't have that trust to come to the table with that mutual goal in mind, it can be a challenge to get through. And it can be a bit superficial at first until you get around that. So that's a work in progress for sure. Another challenge, and I'm interested in talking with Cathy more after this, is as a junior faculty member, trying to justify this work through the tenure process can be a bit tricky, I'm learning. I spend a lot of time at meetings and talking with people that doesn't really reflect on a CV very well. So figuring out a way to explain that process and the development of this work beyond a service obligation or some other bin that it gets put in sometimes has been a bit of a challenge. So those are some of the things I'm working on right now. It's a pretty active process getting through it.
Great. I can go next. I think maybe the key thing for me was to realize that if you're going to engage in this work, I have to be prepared to be transformed by it. It's not work you can do business as usual. It's too deep, and it's based on human relationships that it's going to come back to ask you about what your values are and how you mean to follow through. And I think I had a head start on it before I came to actually graduate school here in India when I was practicing as an architect in rural Rajasthan. And I think it turned on its head everything I had learned in architecture school in India. And I realized that there is the notion of the starchitect and sort of what is done, design with a big D, and sort of, in the vision of the architect. And then there is what the needs of people are and how you actually engage them and give them voice in terms of doing that. So it was a 4-year project I was involved in, and it completely turned things around. And so I think I was somewhat prepared for that. But what was really beautiful was that I came to the Minnesota, and right away as a research assistant started working actually with the DNR and other places on post-occupancy evaluations on buildings. So just a whole different context and a lot of learning on both sides, because I think there was a little bit of surprise, with the DNR folks about what this woman from India is doing here, in Tower and Windham and Ely, Minnesota. So. But that whole interaction, and then in the role as representing the university, how do we kind of negotiate that? So I was faced with, on a recent project with the challenge where, for good reason, the community didn't want the idea that we were considering a specific site revealed to the university, to the rest of the community for a design. And I had to explain that it's really hard to design without a site, and then once you've done it, to keep it secret, especially in a town with a 4th Street downtown. So how do you do that? And then also, what does it mean about our values of inclusion, of transparency, of engagement, and so on? So, but I think this is where the relationship and trust building really mattered, because we were able to, I could authentically tell them that this is going to be a challenge from our side and our partners, the regional partnerships. But we can try to find something in between, and which was then we developed a set of design guidelines for when they picked the site, they could actually apply those, but we couldn't actually design something and then keep it secret, so that's.
I think I'm going to cheat and actually combine Nick and Virajita's responses. So definitely, and say that I think they're linked, and they can actually, they're the challenges, but I think what can kind of get you through. So definitely, Nick, that resonates with me. I'm going through tenure review now, and I would say even past tenure, I think that what we're doing doesn't fit neatly within the forms of how how scholarship is supposed to be recognized. You need to just churn out those papers, right? And that doesn't work very well when you're spending a lot of time in meetings. And then at the same time, Virajita, I hear you, like the transformation and like the amount of time I've spent the last couple of years actually like on self-reflection. I mean, I think it rivals like freshman year in college of like staying up late and being like, what is my purpose in life? And it's kind of, I think at this point in my life, I thought it was kind of past some of that. But I think the reason why I think they're connected is that I think like by going through this transformation, like it made me realize, right, there's something a lot bigger than like my career and what, how many papers and things like that. And so and the trust, if I really did have this trusting relationship with somebody and I'm telling them that I care about what matters to them, it does have to be about that. And I think it kind of helps get through those, like you got to just work that much harder, right, to get through the standard metrics as well. And I'll say maybe the last thing is the whole point is this engagement and collaboration. And we have that not just with our, our tribal partners, but it really is a team, an interdisciplinary team that we're working here with the project that I'm on. And I think it is a lot of work, but I think when we start distributing it as a team that's working together and with our tribal partners, it's also that support to get through the tough aspects of like, how do we deal with that, the struggles of the transformation? How do you get through just all the hard work it is because it doesn't fit neatly in that box?
Cathy?
I had mentioned earlier that when I came to this work as a postdoctoral fellow, I was completely unprepared. We didn't have courses in cultural competence or that sort of thing, and I'd grown up in a very homogenous community. So the first real challenge that I experienced was navigating a community and those relationships that were very different from my own. And as far as what I learned from that and sort of what I talk about in terms of advice or tips for others, I think the first thing is to remember that when you're working with communities that are different from your own, particularly around cultural or ethnic or socioeconomic status, it's to remember that the bulk of the work is personal work as opposed to understanding the cultures of others. And I firmly believe that you do need to understand who you are working with and to be respectful of cultural differences and traditions, but you really need to understand yourself and the culture that you bring and the assumptions that you make and the biases that you might have as a result of that. I think also this idea of this is not really project-based work, but relationship-based work, and the fact that that runs kind of counter to what we are encouraged to do in academia in terms of, turning out those grant proposals, move on to the next thing, publish something, move on to the next thing. That's very challenging. In order to do this work successfully, you need to balance those expectations with what it really takes to do this work, which is to invest in the communities and in the relationships. I think having some perspective around that in terms of taking the long view and recognizing that these are not one-offs, that you are building something, you are investing in something that is going to be that win-win over time. And the more you invest, the more the community invests back in your win, so that it really is investing in each other's wins. Lastly, I would say that particularly back in the early 90s when I was starting this work, it was pretty lonely work. Some of the work that we were doing in the Phelps neighborhood was kind of thought of as pioneering because there was not a lot of that kind of thing happening at the university. And I realized it was really important not to go it alone, that I needed partners, I needed peers to talk to, I needed mentors to talk to. And that realization is one of the reasons why I invest a lot of my time in trying to give back and to serve as that mentor, that peer, that advisor and confidant for others.
Great, thank you. Thanks for sharing kind of the personal insights of doing this work and the personal experiences. I think this work can be it can be emotionally challenging. I think there's physical challenges associated with it. There's a lot of effort, and I think especially within that, the need for a lot of reflection about who you are, how you're thinking about the role that you are in, the privilege and the power that you have in any connections that we're making within the university and outside. So I think these are really powerful stories and reflections on the work that you're doing. So I love it. I wanted to ask, and I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the group and then maybe come back with a couple more questions at the end. But I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts about how we can use engagement to address power inequities, social justice, racism, and other pervasive challenges in our communities and society. Anyone want to start?
Do you want me to start?
I'm sure. I think, as I already mentioned earlier, a major goal in our project is to support our tribal partners in their goals of holding up Indigenous resource sovereignty. And so I think, we could have started this work claiming that that's what we're doing, but unless we're working with our tribal partners, then it's really not that. I think talking about authenticity and sincerity, that's not actually what we're doing. And so, it's reflecting on this question and almost, it's critical. I don't know how we can, as an academic community, do work that is trying to support and move forward questions of social justice and equity without engaging with people that are outside our bubble. So I'd almost say just quite, I guess, plainly, and it's just what has to be done.
Thank you. Virajita.
Yeah, sure. I certainly believe that we have a responsibility. So I'll mention that at the beginning, that we have a responsibility to do that. In fact, just the fact that we're part of the university and we have all of these resources, I think we, just as a university community, have a lot of privilege. And when we do our work, I think asking that question about how is it impacting people, how is it empowering, and how is it meeting the needs of those who are underrepresented and historically have been marginalized is really critical, I think. And it's great to see that awareness over the last few, maybe last decade grow with all of our work. But I also think that I'll go back to sort of the design aspect. I think I mentioned earlier where you can have a project that's outside of you, that we're all working together. And there's ways in design that you can actually engage the question in creative ways. And so I'm thinking back to my teaching the last couple of years in an architectural catalyst studio, where it's connected to the Grand Challenge research project, where we're working with communities in Milan, Minnesota, with Micronesian as well as Dakota partners from Upper Sioux and Lower Sioux reservation. And so for one of the studios, the question I asked was, what does it mean to build for the Micronesian community? And for those of you who don't know, Milan, Minnesota, which was, of course, at once, as we all are, we're standing on Dakota land. So Milan was at one point Dakota, but then largely Scandinavian, Norwegian, population, and now is more than 50% Micronesian because of the immigration of Micronesian people. So if you go to their local store, you'll find signs for ice cream and written in Chukis, and so on. So there's been this transition. So we asked the question that what does it mean to host and provide for the Micronesian community in Milan, Minnesota, on what used to be Dakota lands, was mostly inhabited by Norwegians. So, how do we explore that? And then the next year, and this is in collaboration with Professor Vince Diaz in American Indian Studies and Professor Dan Keefe in computer science. So we're all collaborating on this Grand Challenges projects. We decided to focus because the studio was going to be about making, and what we focused on was that the fact that all these three cultures have boat making in their traditions. So then the whole course, the week-long immersion, was looking at their boat-making traditions and building models and making from the perspective of these different cultures, having community members give us input from Dakota and so on, and also bring in a Norwegian community member who now lives in Hastings, but was one of 25 crew members who sailed a Viking boat that was built in Minnesota many years ago. Maybe some of you have seen it or know it. It's parked somewhere up north, but it was sailed all the way to Norway. And so he came and talked about it. We watched a film about how the boat was made and so on and that. And it turned out that he himself, because I asked him, how did you, navigating that boat from Minnesota to Norway was no mean feat, and how did you personally connect to that work and navigating on the open seas? And he said, it's because I had spent 2 years in Micronesia while in the Peace Corps. So just these interconnections that are happening around us and are present. So anyway, the students then got to engage in that whole cultural question through model making and exploration of design in boat making. So it was profoundly fun and inspiring, So that's, you can use sort of your disciplinary ways of kind of engaging with it.
Thank you.
So.
Nick?
Yeah, so it's a good question and a big one, and clearly a lot of work to be done. I'll give you an example, though, of how I've tried to address it, and it's really at the research prioritization stage. So I've made an effort to, in some ways, level the playing field and use my influence to bring people together around a table to inform the work we do that might have very different roles in the community. So there could be a high-level manager sitting right next to somebody who might not feel like they have a voice. And at that table, a conversation could be had that maybe wouldn't have otherwise happened. So that's an example of how I've tried to address this question in kind of a practical way in a research formulation.
Thank you. Cathy?
I think to the extent that society's problems, whether they be sociopolitical challenges, environmental challenges, whatever, often have at their root a power imbalance, stemming often from the fact that people who are most affected by those issues are often those that are absent from the table. Their voices are not heard. They don't have agency or efficacy in these situations. Then I think these community-engaged scholarship approaches that are about participatory relationships and reciprocity and those 6 tenets that I talked about earlier, and mutual benefit and mutual respect and all of those sorts of things, then I think this is the tool that we as academics have in our academic toolbox in order to address societal challenges, in partnership with folks who are really intimately affected by these things. I think this sort of an approach is also one that brings out the humility in us, which is incredibly important if we're going to make any progress on any of these challenging issues. We need to come to these situations and these relationships with a sense of academic humility and cultural humility, and a sense that we are closer than we think to others who may hold outside or externally some viewpoints that might be different than our own. So I think these sorts of participatory approaches provide a model for us as academics to address, some of our toughest challenges that are built on power imbalances.
Great. Thank you. I would love to open it up to the audience for questions or comments. And we have a mic coming around. So we'll start with Dom, and then I see Lissa and a few others in the middle.
Hi, thank you.
Oh,
Is this
and
on?
if you could say who you are, where you are, and your question.
Okay, thank you. Dominic Travis, College of Veterinary Medicine. Thank you very much for this. I've been trying to do this and failing and partially succeeding for a very long time, so I appreciate all of this. I'm very interested in your thoughts about, since we're an educational institution, the next generation. So my experience with all of our USAID projects and things is that money is power, and helping engage our partners in how to move the money somewhat into their own leadership sphere is one way of empowering and engaging for sustainability. So how do we help our partners have some academic freedom of their own through the next generation?
Thoughts? Crystal?
I can take a stab at that. One really, really major part of our project, it's our students, and we have, so I think you were asking more about, your question might have been targeting more thinking about youth in the communities of our partners. So I'll actually say that I think we're also looking at sort of within our own institutions. And okay, so where I'm going with this is students have been a really major part of our project, and the way they've been a major way is we've had combination of Native students, non-Native students in our projects, and I think the experience has been very much a two-way street. And I think, we're hoping that providing Native students an opportunity to see how their backgrounds can be relevant for what they're studying and what their, training is going to be, has been really, really important. And on the other side, having non-Native students who maybe came in with just an expectation of having a very, standard kind of education work on this project and work with fellow students from a different background. What I'm hoping is actually will facilitate kind of from both sides, from both communities, sort of a future that they can work collaboratively together. And maybe it's hard for us because that's not the way we were trained. That certainly wasn't the way I was trained. But if they're learning early on how to work together, how to see their perspectives valued in being able to solve a problem, we're hoping that that's one way that we're looking to the future.
Virajita.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think I'm going to think about it from the community standpoint first and then come back to the students, because I think that's a really great point. So I invite you to talk to others in the audience. I see Linda Kingery and Mary Oldham Hanneman here, but who are from the regional partnerships as well and kind of know the community perspective. But my sense from all of this work is that because the university was engaged with the communities, resources were drawn to the table for the communities to have access to that would not have otherwise been available. So I think that's sort of that transfer of actual resources and funding and then expertise and partnerships in other ways. So that's really tangible, especially in the rural community work that I do. I don't think those resources are always available, though I have to say that rural communities are extremely enterprising in making things happen once those resources are available, and in fact, actually very much partnering in making that available. So it's, I really don't buy into the deficit kind of perspective of rural communities that often is in the air, because I think they're extremely resourceful and doing a lot with what they have. But it is also true that they don't often get the resources they need. So that's something that the university's partnerships then allows that to happen. And then from a student side, I think the experience is so tremendous to have that. I mean, I've seen direct results for pretty much each of my graduate students who, after they do a project or two, and which can be, a whole new learning curve for them, in negotiating all this complexity and, changing direction. We were going in one way, and now we have to sort of shift gears in terms of the design and what the community thinks, is appropriate. And but I've seen them not only be transformed by the work, but then actually immediately be picked up by the profession that's looking. Sometimes in sort of, I had a landscape architecture student who went to California and started working for the DNR, and then here it was also in firms, in Wisconsin and here, because I think even the professional firms are looking for somebody who has that kind of expertise and complexities, not just the design skills, but how do you apply them in context. So I think it really is a win-win, as you pointed out, where there's leverage and access and impact and so on multiple levels.
Great. Let's jump to another audience question.
Hi, I'm Lissa Polish, and I also work for the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships and Extension. I do energy stuff. So yesterday I had a call with someone who was looking for some advice, and I spent 45 minutes telling him about all of the things that I have screwed up. And at the end of the call, he was like, this was so valuable. And I'm wondering if you might share with us a way in which you have screwed up as you have approached this work, and something that you actually learned from just making a mistake.
Can I start with
Go
that?
ahead, Cathy.
Thank you for that question, because I think we don't spend enough time talking about what goes wrong. We want to put out there our success stories, hold up our achievements, and some of the most important reflection is about when you screwed up. I'll give a quick example of when I and my team screwed up and what we've been able to do to sort of parlay that into something really positive. So after the major part of our work in the Phillips neighborhood on lead poisoning, a subgroup of us went on to work with Sabethany Community Center on a healthy housing project. And it's interesting that the screw up was across the board. It wasn't just me or the academic side, it was all of us, in that the partners from the community organization that we were partnering with were sort of the high-level management people, and we all bought into this idea that they could represent the needs of their clients. And they were doing so with the most positive intentions and respect and somewhat protecting the people that they work with in their communities. And that turned out to be a really bad decision, because what we learned was that you absolutely need to reach out to the folks who are going to be most affected by whatever it is, an intervention, a problem, a societal challenge, and to think that you can speak for anyone who might be affected by those issues is the opposite of humility. And the project utterly failed. I mean, almost like ready to turn back the money to the funder kind of failure. What we ended up doing instead, the funder was great and said, why don't you just really reflect on what happened here and try to make lemonade out of lemons, I guess. And out of that, a group of us formed to develop an initiative that we call What Went Wrong. And we hosted a conference a number of years ago that was called What Went Wrong. Interestingly, it was held here in Cedar Riverside, and taking advantage of the strengths in this community and utilizing the space here and the businesses here, et cetera, and it actually became a national conference. It was sort of unexpected that it was going to become a national conference, but it was really, really an amazing discussion around the challenges, and out of that, our small subgroup has developed a tool that we call the wrongness model, where we are providing both a physical tool and an exercise for partnerships to examine missteps and to really get to the bottom of what could be initially sounding sort of superficial kind of conflict, and really get down into, what are the power dynamics and what are sort of the historical, perhaps historical trauma roots of some of those challenges. And it's really been a useful tool, and we've been, trying to teach about it out in the community. So lemonade out of lemons.
All right, maybe a couple more. comments?
Yeah, I've got plenty of examples, for better or worse. I've tried to use them as learning experiences too, and adapt the process going forward. But to give a specific example, and I'll maybe leave the details out because it might be familiar to some of you. We've had a fair bit of work on risk-based management, and that dovetails awfully close with regulatory recommendations eventually. And I've learned painfully that getting out in front of a regulatory agency when making a recommendation, especially at the legislature or in the governor's office, is not a comfortable place to be. And it ultimately was a bust too. Despite what I think is quality of the science, it didn't matter at that point. And I lost a lot of trust during that experience. So I reflected a lot on that, gone back, and really thought about the communication with not just broad stakeholders, but thinking strategically too as it comes to endgame, and accounting for that early in the process is really, really important.
Great. Virajita, do you
Yeah,
want to share?
sure. Is Cathy Doty here? I think she was here earlier, but basically Cathy leads the Hennepin University partnership. But the project that I'm thinking of is for the Hennepin County that I did a few years ago with some design colleagues, and it was the design of the juvenile justice center, waiting room in terms of waiting for sort of having families and people who are going through processes there to actually wait in the space. And we were charged by the county to actually redesign the space, make it interactive, and just make it a better space in general. And using our design thinking, which is, of course, as you can imagine, nonlinear, and it reaches and expands in multiple directions, we realized the problem is less about putting interesting furniture and gadgets in the waiting room space, but rather redesigning sort of how people end up there, and also the fact that they have no information about where they are in the larger process, and so they're waiting sort of powerlessly there, not knowing when their turn will come. And sometimes it's a mother with many kids who's trying to navigate the process for one of her children and so on. So we realized that the design problem wasn't so much the space itself and what we do to make it entertaining, but rather redesign the system. Now that was not appreciated by our clients. And it felt like we had kind of expanded the scope without reason. And so that was interesting, and that felt like a failure because clearly we had not met the need of our clients. But I think what we did with that was that I reached out again after the project was done. We did do the things they had asked for, but I reached back and said that, can we talk about this? Can we unpack this? And so on. And I think that conversation really helped because they started to see where we were coming from, and we were able to address sort of their concerns about it and sort of talk about, once you start seeing things in design, you have to bring them to the table. We can't kind of ignore them and so on. So, but it felt like a sense of failure that, we haven't met what they needed. I don't know how that impacted further beyond the project, and that's the challenge sometimes. So these are discrete projects where you do and then you have to move on.
Great. Crystal?
Okay, yeah, definitely. So we messed up at the first step. And I would say, so I actually probably should have mentioned our project is funded by Grand Challenges and by IonE. And we, as we all know, we're running behind. We're throwing together our proposal, with way less time than we actually need. And, we had really built our proposal. It was backed by tribal partners. We had letters of support from tribal partners of members of our team. So we were really kind of, using kind of previous connections there. And we put together a proposal that talked about community engaged research. We talked in the proposal about how that engagement has to start at the very beginning from the proposal development stage. And so we had maybe 2 email exchanges and 2 phone calls, and that was it for our proposal. And I'll say that I think we faked it well enough that, Grand Challenges and IonE bought it, that, we were going to be doing this community engaged research. We got the grant, we're like, all right, let's go. And after probably, I don't know, months after those 2 phone calls and 2 emails at the beginning to make sure that we'd get the letters of support, we hadn't actually talked at all with these partners. And because at that time, we certainly weren't acting as partners, right? And they were like, yeah, I mean, basically, they kind of gave us the cold shoulder. We're like, let's go. We already have our whole research plan laid out, and we want to start executing it, and we know what, step 1 is. And they just stepped back, and we're like, why aren't they really returning our emails? And one of them was like, well, just think about it. Did you actually think you developed that proposal with us? We read it afterwards, and you said you did. And they were totally right. And, I'd like to say that we had the right intentions. I think we believed that that's what we were doing. And I've got to say 2 phone calls and 2 emails was far more than I've ever done in the past. And I will say, I should actually make it clear, I think we have people on our team who have more experience with this. And I guess, unfortunately, I was the one leading it. And like I said, 4 communications, wow, that's 4 more than I've ever done in my entire history before. And so it stung. I mean, that's where we were. We were totally called out as being hypocrites, which we were. And so the way we dealt with it was we said, okay, we're going to start the process right now. We're going to redo it. We're actually, yes, we have this whole research plan. We're putting it aside. So we put it aside, and we actually spent solidly the first half year of the project just visiting different reservations, different tribal organizations, anybody who was open to us going to visit them, and we met with them and we listened. I think we talked about this, and I think the first couple meetings we talked too much, and we kind of called ourselves out on this. No, the whole point is that we weren't listening enough, and so it was I think going back to how long this type of research takes, it does take way longer than a standard project by far, because we are used to, you get down your ideas within the 2 months that you have to write a proposal, and then you just go with it. And we had to, I guess, humility, somebody's already mentioned that, we had to say, we were wrong. We were wrong. And I'd have to say that things started turning around when our tribal partners saw that we acknowledged that we were wrong, and that we were willing to do the work to change it. And I think that they were actually hugely generous to be able to move forward after that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. Another question.
Hi, Teddy from the School of Nursing. Thank you for your transparency and your humility. It's very refreshing and wonderful. I'm wondering if you can share some best practices of community-based dissemination, in that it tends to be the academics that publish the papers, the academics speak at the conferences. How do you ensure that the community also presents the findings?
Go for it.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something that communication is really important, especially in the back end, and it's a conversation that we have with the project team really early in the process. So we understand, this goes back to the win-win, like I need a published paper out of the deal, and them presenting it in their voice is also really important. And so we set that up right away and try to give them a platform, if we can give them a platform to speak from as a partner in the effort. Waiting till the end and assuming that it's just going to get itself out there has not been very effective. So starting it early is what we've tried to do to address that.
Great. Cathy?
I think these ideas are really important. I think it's also important that we as academics build our own skill set of being able to translate what we do for audiences that are not academic audiences, in addition to working directly with partners to allow them to speak in their own voice. So we at IonE have a number of leadership development opportunities to do just that sort of thing. And so go to our website and learn about speaking science and things like that. But I think that an increase in our own capacity to do that sort of communication and the humility to know when to promote the voices of community members is an important skill as well.
Great.
I
Virajita.
have two things that come to mind, and one actually involves you, Teddy. Both Teddy Potter and I are on the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies board, and that is an open access journal that also has a community voices track. First thing, it's free and open access, but then it has a community voices track. So there's academic voices as well as community voices that can be. But that said, that's sort of one way to open the doors to that. But I also think that we need to think about other ways of what we mean by academic presentations and publishing. I think, I know Vince Diaz, who I mentioned earlier, has brought community members for presenting our Grand Challenges work project, so there's that. But the most recent event that I'm thinking of that actually presented the research but in a wholly different way that Crystal was also part of was where we brought both our Grand Challenge projects together for a one-day event not last Thursday, but the Thursday before, by the boathouse, where we had a gathering, an event from 11 to 4 p.m. of the Wild Rice Research Project, as well as the Back to Indigenous Futures Project. There was a bus full of Micronesian community members, women, men, children who came. There was also Dakota and Ojibwe community members, partners on our projects who came. There were professors, there were administrators, and then from 2:30 to 3:30, President Gable was there, and the Micronesian and Dakota community members welcomed her. There were sacred ceremonies. She was taken on a boat ride in a Micronesian outrigger canoe, and then brought back, even while there were research presentations of our materials produced by my students and Crystal and her team's work. So to me, that was the full embodied view of what academic work and research is and can be. It's a celebration, it's an expression of culture, and it's intellectual achievements and all of that, but it left with a sense of wholeness that I rarely get. It's often either or. So I think I would like to advocate that we do more of that.
Great. Crystal, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. So I will say that actually, we've been thinking about this, but actually some of our tribal partners have made clear that the academic papers are also very important for them, actually for legal purposes, for if there's going to be, legal hooks. But definitely it can't just end there. And I guess maybe a couple of experiences in addition to the one that Virajita just mentioned, with our two Grand Challenges groups and partners, but the two that I can also add to that is we've actually had now, I guess we kind of call it a knowledge exchange workshop, where we've gone to visit one of the bands with which we work, and we had a group from our team there, and they had maybe 10, 15 members of their. Many of them were tribal natural resource managers, but from different divisions and at different levels, some, more junior to more senior, where we had a chance to just share our methods and our understanding about things. And so I think that's been a very valuable experience. And actually, with that same partnering band, they have invited us to their annual Wild Rice Feast celebration. And I think that's been another opportunity for our partners to be able to introduce us, the researchers, with others in their communities. And it's been an opportunity to share a meal together and speak in that way together. And I'd say beyond that, I think we are looking to our direct tribal partners, who are mostly tribal natural resource managers, to help facilitate the dissemination of the information, because I think we're understanding that they're the ones who understand best how their communities can and should be receiving the information that's coming out of this project. But I mean, I guess once again, I'll say I think I'm maybe the newest one in this panel to this type of work. So we're still, I think, very much in a learning beginning phase in our project, but I see it being very important to really look to our direct partners for understanding what is that most appropriate form of dissemination of information with their communities.
Thank you. We have just about 5 minutes left, and so maybe one more question? Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Aruna Raman. I'm a first-year PhD student, but I also was the India director of the AKARA program for a number of years. And I'm also a startup entrepreneur. So one question I have, when you mentioned, Cathy, about community dynamics and power dynamics, communities are not amorphous, right? There are multiple stakeholders within the communities. And through my years of work, at the intersection of learning abroad and working with grassroots communities, I've had experiences where, we've trusted a community partner who often is a flagship nonprofit working for a number of years in the community and, gone on visits and found out that what the communities want is completely different. In fact, they don't even want us there, and what they represent is often shed in a very poor light. So have any of you had experiences, navigating the stratification within communities, and how have you dealt with them?
Thank you. Virajita, do you want to share?
I could start. Actually, it reminds me of some of the work that I've done in India as well. And there is always this phenomena of the middlemen or the middle women, as the case might be. But so what are those entities? And I think there too, it could be that does the mediating organizations can be telling a story about what is being achieved on the ground, and then it's not actually the case and we don't hear it. So I guess the only way to circumvent that is to have direct access. And also to kind of, when you're hearing about what is happening, to keep, maybe a researcher's lens of needing to see evidence of that, right? It's not just what you're being told, but you need more evidence of that, and then going as directly to the source as possible. And therefore, it's not always possible to do that. I know some of these sort of global projects are done in this way, where money is transferred and then it keeps going. But I think as directly close to the ground with communities is important. And so in sort of some of our projects, what we prefer is direct community engagement, that we are actually connecting with the community ourselves, even though we have partners who are facilitating that process. So we are hearing the voices of the community ourselves and making some of our own judgments and then bringing that to the discussion with our partners, and not relying only on the interpretation of partners to kind of do that. So that's my best suggestion.
Right. Does anyone else want to share on that one? Crystal?
Yeah, I think we definitely have experiences. I think I was even just mentioning that we rely very much on our tribal partners and their natural resource managers. I would say that probably the couple of bands that we've done the most work with, I think that they have made sure that we also are talking with elders from their community, which absolutely it's not a monolithic community, just as University of Minnesota is not a monolithic community, and with their wild rice chiefs. And we always ensure that we have the official tribal council I guess, permissions to work there. And so at least through, with these couple of bands, I think it's been an example where we at least felt there was at least more than one entity within that band that is, behind us working with them. But I will say that's not always the case for sure. There's definitely one band from which there have been various individuals who've engaged in our project, and some of them have been very favorable about us working together, but there have been others who have been extremely wary, and one of whom has been starting to change her mind and say that she feels like she's seeing evidence that perhaps she would like to work with us, but she says she still finds that it would be very difficult to convince the elders in her, from her band that it would be ever acceptable to work with us. And so where we are with that is we definitely make sure from our end that we're never pushing. It is their decision, and if there is an agreement, we are happy to speak with individuals from that band who would like to talk with us, but we will never try to work there or try to contact anyone from tribal council about working there unless we've been given indication. And unfortunately, so far, that has been working. There's not been a disagreement to the level of somebody really pushing hard for us to work there, but somebody pushing back. We've said that, we'll step back until there is a decision that's made on their part as to whether or not we should work there.
Great. All right. Good. I think we're out of time, but Cathy or Nick, any last quick thoughts on that? Okay. I want to thank you for being here for this panel. I want to thank IonE for centering this conversation around community engaged scholarship and community engagement in the IonE meeting with this broader community. I think it's really powerful to be having this conversation and really see it integrated into the priorities. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to help facilitate this conversation. I'm grateful to the panelists for sharing fantastic insights, and I think also just wonderful inspiration for doing this work, and also just talking about it in a way that's very personal. And I think for any of us who've done this work, there's a lot of that in it, and I think it's really important to be able to highlight that. And thank you for great questions, and I know that we didn't get to them all, and I'm hopeful we can have more conversation over lunch. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.